Mic check.
So it's a bit loud.
Check.
Oh, that's got a letter in.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. We might kick off. Could I just start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today in Canberra, the Ngunnawal people, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to everyone with connections to this land. Good morning, everybody. It's a real delight to be here and lovely to see you all. My name's Bronte Moules. I'm from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm DFAT's Ambassador for Human Rights and head up the Human Rights branch. We're here, I'll introduce the panel in just a moment, but what we're here to do in this panel, as you know, is to talk about rising authoritarianism and the global anti-rights movement, which we're all, unfortunately, all too familiar with. We also want to look at really the impact on democracies globally, but also particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, as evidenced through all the rollbacks we're seeing on gender and sexual rights, and indeed across human rights more broadly, I would argue. So let's kick off firstly by introducing our wonderful panel. So first of all, we have Jelle Postma, who's the founder and CEO of Justice for Prosperity, which is a Dutch NGO that conducts research that's all about identifying and unveiling how structures of subversion work, how they remain undetected so often, and how they harm and endanger vulnerable communities. He holds extensive research, many of you will be familiar with it, I'm sure, in international diplomacy, counter-terrorism, and in researching, investigating, and tracking the anti-rights opposition. So a warm welcome, Jelle. And we also have Mina Barling. So Mina is the Director of External Relations at IPPF. She oversees IPPF's global strategic partnerships, the resource mobilisation efforts, political and multilateral advocacy, social movement building, and more, all in the one job, which sounds quite extraordinary. Welcome, Mina. Jack Hayes is a researcher from the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, and he's a PhD candidate at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs here at ANU. And his research expertise includes LGBTI plus representation in Australian politics and international diplomacy, democratic and electoral health, and good governance in public service. So some fascinating research going on there. Welcome. And Lady Lisondra is a youth and advocacy advisor for IPPF for the East and Southeast Asia and Oceania region. In this role, Lady supports IPPF's work with young activists, and she's responsible for tracking policy advocacy shifts in the region. Such important work for sexual and reproductive health and rights. So we're going to discuss strategies to counter the pushback against gender and sexual rights. We're going to look at the role of cross-sectoral partnership and movement building, which I think is obviously one of the many really important values of this whole conference, and doing this all to counter, obviously, regressive anti-rights campaigns. So we're going to discuss strategies to tackle misinformation, how we can coordinate more strategically as sectoral partners and policymakers to align our messaging and to develop programming, of course, and work more cohesively from the grassroots to the regional and global levels. And we'll also spend a little bit of time reflecting on Australia's role in defending and promoting human rights in the region and multilateral forums. We will have half an hour, the last half an hour, for Q&A, so start thinking and jotting down your questions, which I'm sure will be many. So we just want to start off by setting the global context, which is frankly a little bit of a dismal affair, of course, at the moment, but it is really important for all we're doing to have that clear understanding of the global context. So, Jelle, it would be great to hear from you, given your experience and deep expertise in researching and tracking the anti-rights movement. Are you able to give us just a bit of an overview of the global state of play on what rollbacks and what all this means for the future of our democracies? Thank you.
Thank you so much also for your kind words and introduction, and thanks to DFAT for having us. It's really great to be together and have this incredibly important conversation together. I really hope for some difficult questions afterwards. So What we see globally, I think we all know that we're not in the best place right now. We see an extreme right to a shift to the right, to nationalism, the focus on, and this is of course for DFAT, I think especially important, a focus on a shift from multilateralism to bilateral relationships, which is not only a trend, it's something that's planned. It's especially if you, for example, we hear about Project 2025. We all know this project from the Heritage Foundation, of course, the playbook for the incoming president, with an explicit focus also in this region on building bilateral relationships and taking down the multilateral partnerships. So that's a trend we see, combined, of course, with protectionism. What we do as an organization, we investigate. I'm a former intelligence officer, and we decided together with some colleagues to continue our work, but then for good, as you would say that. So we support groups under siege to help them identify who's attacking them and what to do about it. And for that, one of the tools we use is an AI detection tool to measure polarization. And what we do is we take polarized topics. It can be any topic. That's different country per country, but there's some commonalities, of course, globally. SRHR, LGBTQ, climate is coming up, of course, and many more. And what we do is we take those polarized topics and then we backtrack. So where did it start? Because then you find out that 9 out of 10 times these things, they don't start by coincidence. There are actors there, persons, networks, and organizations that benefit from destabilization of democracies. And in the end, it's not about ideology, it's about power and money. I'll talk a little bit later on about the deep dive we just did in this region. As far as we're concerned, very much under-researched. It needs a lot more research on a global scale because this region is suffering the same situation that we saw years ago in Africa and elsewhere, Ukraine even, and we all know what's happening there. So what we do is we look at these topics and we look at the persons and the organizations that start this polarization. A little bit of polarization is not a bad thing. That's how a democracy works. It becomes a problem when it starts to become in and out group thinking. Either you're with me or you're against me. Then it will become a problem, because that's where societies divide, and that's where divide and conquer works for autocrats, for oligarchs, for it can be anything. I'll talk about it. I can explain a little bit now. What we do is we research 3 groups. Because there's many actors out there. We use a triangle, an anti-rights triangle, to keep our sanity, in order to keep a little bit of structure. So we look at the first group, that's the extremists and the influencers. What we consider them to be are more or less the foot soldiers of the cooperation of these 3 groups. They are the ones that spread the disinformation and mainly are the multipliers. So it's not the ones that started out with, but they are the multipliers. And it's 9 out of 10 times it's just paid. Sometimes when it's about extreme right, then it's more intrinsically motivated. Results is the same. The second group is the political group, the populist political elements, and there's so many out there. I don't think I have to mention the examples from the US. The EU is shifting extremely hard to the right with these populist, right-winged, far-right parties now. I really hope that we can keep a stable France and that the Alternative for Deutschland is not growing too fast. So it's really concerning. Then the final group, last but certainly not least, that's the ultra-conservative, often religious organizations and networks. Those, as far as we're concerned, are the main drivers. Those we use a lot of breach data that is released after hacks. The hackers, they send this information to us. We don't hack, by the way, ourselves, because we stay on the legal side. But we do receive a lot of those breach data sets. And in all honesty, these are the groups that have the plans, the strategies that look into 10 years, 20 years ahead. It all starts with, of course, defund IPPF, but we all know that by now. The strategies are insanely well structured, very intelligent, and very well funded. And again, the topics, they don't really care about the topics. It's not about LGBTQ, it's not about SRHR, abortion, or women's rights. It's about furthering their own goal, power and money. It's unfortunate and very sad and heartbreaking to see that the women and the girls and LGBTQ communities, migrants, suffer the severe consequences.
Thank you, Jelle. That was a really insightful, if depressing, opening. But thank you. No, it's important to set the context. That's what we're here to talk about. So thank you. Mina, we've touched on, or we all know, it's been a big year for elections. In fact, 2024 was the biggest year in history for elections. It'd be really interesting to hear just some of your insights on what this has meant for SRHR specifically, and the impact this has had on the influence of the anti-rights actors on a global scale. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for having us as well. Yes, so I think we've had something like 65 elections this year, or will have by the end of the year. So it's a very unique moment in history. And also, as we're seeing this shift, not just to right, to ultra-right governments, we've been looking at what happens with social movements and who are essentially the voting base in both at the national level, but also globally. What has been the shift and how have we come to there? We saw, of course, in Argentina, this profound shift to the right, very focused on SRHR gender as sort of an organising principle against our movement. And we've all followed what's been happening in the US. And I just want to say something to this because it has very important learnings around social movements that impact this country as well. What we saw there was the left and those that would classically vote for Democrats shift. We saw a voting population, I think something like the size of Australia, that were just so revolted really by what's happening in Palestine and elsewhere that they simply couldn't bring themselves to vote. We saw huge dislocation from the political process. The campaign by the Democrats really ran on our issues. They ran on sexual reproductive health and rights, but they didn't speak to working classes. They didn't commit an end to the supply of weapons. They had marginalised younger populations, those that were protesting in campuses like this. And it's really had devastating consequences for our movement. Now, the issue is now, of course, we have until January the 20th, I think it is, until the change. But there are still actions now that are very, very destructive for the movement. There's been a bill recently, HR 9495, that attempts to silence NGOs and others speaking out about what's going on in the world. The organisations that bill attempts to silence are organisations like ours. And to the issue on SRHR, LGBTQI, if you look at the protests and organising happening globally at the moment, especially on Palestine, on Myanmar and elsewhere, the organising is led by feminists, it's led by queer communities, not just in the US, UK, but also in the Middle East, Asia. And so we have this really dangerous moment that we're all confronted with. What we're also seeing, Jelle mentioned what we think we're going to see in Germany, which is devastating, but what we saw in the Netherlands, Italy and elsewhere, it's become hugely destructive to the multilateral spaces. And the issues that once we held the moral high ground on, especially around gender justice, access to safe abortion, etc., we're losing that moral authority. So there's a huge change in how we can organise, how we can stand up for human rights. And that's going to be a threat we're going to be seeing over the next 5-10 years at least. I'll end there because I know that you have more questions, but just in terms of setting the scene for the next questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Mina. That's really useful. Thank you. Would like to move now a little bit more to our region, to the Asia-Pacific region, and some of the trends that we're observing here, closer to home. IPPF and Justice for Prosperity have done recently some joint tracking of anti-rights influence and actors across, I understand, about 10 countries in the region. So first, Jelle, it would be really interesting to hear from you a bit about this research and the findings, and then just to flag, Jack and Lady, it'd be great. We might talk a little bit more about some of the tactics and that are used by the anti-rights movement. But first, this really interesting research. Jelle, if we could hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Of course. We did a deep dive in the region together with IPPF. We indeed taken a closer look at 10 countries in the region. And we see the same things happening here as we see elsewhere. The same tactics are used, the same modus operandi. It's the same players. We know them very well by now. The same countries as non-state actors, as we call them in the intelligence community, are involved. So I'm going to just touch upon some of these actors. As I said, we work in 3 groups, so I will group them accordingly. So first, on the more political and state level, we see, obviously, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm well aware of that, we see a lot of Russia and a lot of China. We all are aware, I think, in this region that China is both above the radar and under the radar, very active. Above the radar, of course, we know about the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. We also know that there's a lot of Chinese companies active in the region. Some doing great work, and others, and we just talked about it in this discussion, it's gray, it's all gray. And that's why it's so difficult. There is no right and wrong, there's no black and white, there is no clear choice, you're with me or you're against me. Some is legit, some supports, and most of it is very damaging. And this is, of course, when I talk about the logging that's taking place and the forced marriages that are connected to that in Solomon and elsewhere. This is about human rights, it's about women's rights, it's about gender-based violence. And even though that we have not found specific evidence for manipulation of policy making or legislative proposals in, for example, the Solomons, correlation, of course, doesn't mean causation, but it sure as hell is profitable for these companies to facilitate this and make sure that it's not being policed and that these women are, and I say women, but 9 out of 10 times it's girls that are being forced into marriage and traded as sex slaves. So that's the more of the corruption and natural resources side. Then we go to Russia. They are a little bit behind in the success rate. They very much are doing what they do best. So they come in with religion, culture, and language. That's the first step. of course, to support it with funds. There's a fund launched by Putin himself that finances these activities. So this is the Russian Orthodox Church that is taking the first step, and then it's the culture and the language. Of course, we also see on state actors Saudi Arabia quite active when it's about Indonesia. And then we see the local actors when it's on the political level. Also a lot of corruption in the region. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here. But for us, that was the gravity of that was a little bit overwhelming. Then the ultra-conservative groups, I will go a little bit faster because I'd love to give you an example of a very interesting event that we found. So the ultra-conservative, often religious, that's of course the Christianity, that's including with the recent visit of the Pope, the Vatican very much involved. Even when we go to extreme right meetings, we often see cardinals sent by the Vatican to represent them. So this is not right or wrong again, but they're there. We see ultra-conservative organizations. Citizen Go, for example, in the Philippines, very active, a lot of traditional family and property. And of course, the American evangelical people that you see around the globe, very much involved with anti-LGBTQ legislation, for example, in Uganda, Kenya, etc. Same people. And then the influencing and the extremist side, we see both a lot of influencers active. We see, of course, Sputnik as the Russia propaganda channel active and very much cooperating also with the Chinese. And keep an eye out for the new telecom projects that you will see pop up more and more in the region in cooperation with Huawei. The leaders of faith is another very concerning element that we have seen. Again, no right, wrong, but we have found evidence of many faith leaders distributing disinformation. We need to make sure that we keep a difference between, but I think we'll hear a little bit about that later, difference between misinformation and disinformation. Please keep them apart. Disinformation is about deliberate manipulation of the truth, so to speak. So perhaps, and of course, yeah, the recruiting of new allies, local allies, by inviting people for trips and overwhelming them, overloading them with new phones and laptops and what have you not. And that's, of course, in this region, not something that you get every day. And it works like a charm. So how this works, I will give you one example of someone. You can read about it in the report. So this is also an incentive for you to read the report that was just mentioned. It will be launched today by IPPF. So let's call him Mr. B. Career diplomat. He's a French person. Started to work in the Central African Republic as an advisor to the Department of Education. Soon worked his way up to become the advisor to the president. We suspect already then the first interaction with the Russian authorities. Later, and for those who, I'm working towards Vanuatu. So you just know, why is he starting about the car? Well, we all know where Vanuatu is. This has to do, of course, with the passport scheme. This has to do with the legislation on LGBTQ 2 times in the recent weeks. So this person working in the car currently is very much dominated by the Wagner Group's recent execution of 300 civilians. That's the result. So this Mr. B, at a certain point, he becomes the special envoy to Hungary for the Central African Republic. There's many things where you say, what did he just said? Yeah, well, that's what happened. So he went to live in Budapest. Of course, we all know how Budapest is doing. Fast forward, he currently holds position as the special envoy to Vanuatu on behalf of Russia and Israel. I don't know, ma'am, if you ever got that far to represent two countries, but it's a special trick. And with that, of course, he was very active in promoting the dual nationality that you could obtain. Many Russians profited from his service, of course, with him profiting financially. We were offered a dual nationality for almost 120K. It was really funny because that was the day that the European Parliament kicked him out of the Schengen visa-free travel program. I don't know if all are aware, but just in case. Vanuatu was one of the lucky countries that had an agreement with the Schengen area so that they could travel, their people could travel visa-free to Schengen. And of course, you all know, within Schengen, you can travel freely without passport control in the Schengen area. So that was a gold mine, of course, because the Russians have a little bit more difficulties currently coming into the Schengen area. So what do? You sell your citizenship to Russians, giving them visa-free travel to the Schengen area. That couldn't continue, so the European Parliament, they cancelled the agreement with Vanuatu. The people of Vanuatu suffering first, right? So the short-term profit was made. He holds 3 offices in France. He's French, of course, Moscow, and Vanuatu is very much involved in real estate. And now we see, as said, the LGBTQ legislation withdrawn. So you see these activities, they come with corruption, they come with making a lot of money, etc. And they definitely also use divide and conquer when it comes to active polarization and the in and out group thinking, instrumentalizing that to manipulate the country, to destabilize and then to profit.
Thank you, Jelle. That's fascinating. And thank you for those. I think having some of these very practical stories is very useful. It gives us a real insights into the interconnected nature of these issues and across so many borders and people. Really interesting. And can I thank you also and IPPF for this research? It's just invaluable. It's so important for what we're trying to do. So really appreciate the work that's gone into that. As I said, it'd be good to look now a little bit more about, delve even deeper into the kind of tactics that are being used. So Jack, in terms of your work and how you've seen some of this playing out in the region, be interesting to hear a bit more, including, around your research about how anti-rights actors operate, particularly to target certain issues such as LGBTQI+ and women's rights. Be great to hear from you a bit more about that.
Yeah,
Thanks.
of course. It's a pleasure to be here. I could listen to the experts on the panel all day, and I do want to reiterate Jelle's request that everyone read the report because it is fantastic. It's a really important contribution to the space, and I would absolutely recommend it. And while my office being 5 minutes down the road doesn't necessarily give me regional expertise, I do want to reiterate everything that's been said thus far, particularly in the context of if you are under the disillusionment that this is something that is going to arrive to the region or that we're keeping an eye out for it to arrive into Australian digital spaces or to our shore, it's well and truly already here. These are truly global networks and they work within the region, and keeping an eye out for the existing, architecture and infrastructure and the ways in which the anti-rights movement is already being facilitated in that space it's already a necessity, not something that we're predicting. I use architecture and infrastructure, I think, very purposefully because there are kind of dual elements to this online space. Architecture and infrastructure are really purposeful things. They speak to systems that are built around a geography, but an ecosystem grows, it proliferates, and I think that they are inextricably linked and enabled by each other. But yeah, they are absolutely these infrastructures of anti-rights and the ecosystems that proliferate them are already here in the region. And the online space is a particularly rife space, particularly vulnerable space for minoritized communities, because it has enabled a lot of the conditions that the anti-rights movement is combating against. It's been a really fantastic tool in the region for women's political, social, and economic emancipation. And so it presents itself as a really viable target to roll back those rights. I think there's an academic, Emma J, who describes some of the activity of the anti-rights movement as economic vandalism, because it's this opportunity for women to achieve economic emancipation by running small businesses online. And if you make an online space a hostile space for a woman to be in, then you're cutting her off from a number of economic opportunities and a number of political and social opportunities as well. Regarding the tactics, I think that these are going to be deeply familiar and not actually all surprising to anyone in the audience, because we all have an online presence and we all have social media to a certain extent. And these are probably the things that we already find really bloody frustrating about these spaces. The thing about the anti-rights movement is that their job is quite easy and the tactics are really simplistic. There are concepts such as flooding or fogging. Fogging is the undermining of trust in government sources or trusted sources. We saw that particularly in the United States election recently, but it's really present in our region as well. I think there was a Pulse Asia survey in the Philippines recently or maybe last year, that determined that people can recognize dis and misinformation online, but it's the sources of those dis and misinformation that become a little bit fraught. They identify the first primary source as online bloggers and kind of influencers, but the second source is their news and mainstream media. So the two largest mainstream media companies within the Philippines are also identified as the largest source of misinformation, which that is tricky because sometimes governments do lie and it is difficult to get around that fact. But I think we were having a conversation earlier about truth now as a movable object, and truth is something you can reinterpret to your own will. And that's really present in the space, and that's something that fogging really takes advantage of. Flooding is much easier. It's just flooding a digital ecosystem with as much information or misinformation as possible, particularly with a certain narrative or a counter-narrative in a way that undermines the legitimacy of someone's point of view. These technologies are really enabled by kind of nascent and emerging technologies as well. So something like AI really, as you would be able to understand, really benefits someone whose MO is producing as much content as possible and to saturate a digital ecosystem. I would really recommend a policy paper written by Dr. Elise Stevenson in the IWDA policy paper series. It's about AI and feminist foreign policy, and she does a really great job in summarizing interventions as to ways in which we need to regulate that space before it kind of, grows life of its own. I don't know, I'm also, to move beyond, I guess, the tactics and perhaps a little bit of a response as to how people can navigate in this very necessary digital system that we find ourselves in and can't really disentangle ourselves from. It's a little bit fraught on a personal level because at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're very interested and we're very affirmed in acknowledging that we're not out to fix women, we're out to fix systemic oppression or systems that inhibit women's ability to achieve political emancipation. So I'm reticent, I think, to recommend individual tactics in a space that actually needs structural reform. But one of the things that needs to happen is, unfortunately, offline conversations. I think it was a couple of years ago around Christmas that I had to look over my dad's shoulder at his Twitter feed, and I was blown away by how it was just a completely different website to the one that I was experiencing in some very concerning ways. I think this was the first year of COVID. And that really hammered home to me one of the only tactics that's really recommended in the literature, which is that you need to be having offline conversations with people that you care about. It's really difficult, and sometimes it doesn't move a lot of ideologies or opinions, but it is the very first and very necessary step. And apart from that, the broader tactics speak to intervention on behalf of governments. Australia has an enormous appetite for asking social media companies to regulate these spaces. I think that's important, but it also It's more like whacking a Band-Aid on an open wound. It doesn't really acknowledge the fact that the problem will continue to exist. I'm worried that I'm going to answer all of these questions with just the punchline that it's very complicated and nuanced, but it's very complicated and nuanced, so.
Thanks very much, Jack. That's a very fair point. But I think also your point about at that very practical, basic level about offline conversations is a really interesting one, because I think in all of our discussions today there's a lot to be pessimistic about, let's be honest, and in all of our work there's a lot to be discouraged about. But I do think out of all this we will, and through these conversations, find through the extraordinary wisdom of the people who are here, and all of you, find some of these essentially some causes for hope, things we can work with in a practical way. And I think that's it's such a simple, it's obviously not going to fix everything. I'm not being sort of overly rosy about this, but I think the fact that some of those offline conversations on some of these really difficult issues in this world that we live in, I like to think, and maybe this is too much optimism coming through, but you have a better chance of sort of bringing out the best in people sometimes, or finding that core of, the good parts of humanity when you're having in-person conversations. So it is something I think that's really interesting to think about more. Moving to Lady now, we're really keen to hear about your experiences. Obviously, we've been talking about the tactics and some of the methods, which interested in your take on that too. But also, in particular, what's your take on the actual impact on activists and organisations on the ground? That would be really great to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Thank you, and lovely to have us here. It basically just derails our work to provide sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it does spread a lot of hate and fear that is internalized across the lifespan. So practically, even for me, I grew up with it. So it's not coming in, we grow with it, we live with it. We see this from institutions. We see that they've cemented their hold on these tactics in rearing children, young people. So you see that in our country, you've mentioned, we've had this surveys like that, this trust, that is true. We've had the longest fight for our reproductive health law. And in the same years that we fought for that law, they've significantly decreased the knowledge on HIV among young people. So young people's rights have always been a bargaining chip, and even that in our law. They said, we will pass the law if you would just exclude mandatory comprehensive sexuality education. And that was like, oh wow. As a young person advocating for the law, that what just happened? So it constantly derails the work that we do to promote sexual and reproductive health and rights, but also that continuous perpetration of oppression, suppression, repression within our communities and within our societies. So you see this again in education systems, wherein even as healthcare providers, you're taught that abortion is illegal, abortion is a crime. So how does that express now in terms of providing care? You have this stigma all around it. You have providers saying, oh, we don't want to provide care because we don't want to be accessories to the crime. And even in our health system, so recently we've had these issues on maternal deaths and post-abortion care. So we see that post-abortion care is something that's humane and compassionate, and it's within this moral acceptability. So in 2016, we had the national policy on post-abortion care. So that being protecting women's rights to get safe, compassionate, and accessible care. But in 2 years, this was reversed, saying that the national policy on the prevention of illegal and unsafe abortion. So then the first national policy was co-developed with communities. The second one was a split overnight policy that was out. So you could see that just in the same span of years that you're fighting, you're winning, you're losing at the same time. And this does not stop. So in the Philippines, abortion is still criminalized, And even if we have engaged a lot with our Commission of Human Rights, there's been backtrack. So the support had been withdrawn last year in terms of decriminalization of abortion, because at the Senate hearing, they issued an ultimatum that we cannot give you funding if you do not correct your position, which is against the Constitution and against the Penal Code. So immediately, overnight, all of the years of hard work again, just like died. So we're at this conundrum of like one win, and then we're 2 steps back.
Thank you. That's a really interesting illustration of how this plays out in practice and the depth of the challenges in getting around that. Thank you. So we've been talking a bit now, and I think have a good sort of picture about obviously the anti-rights movement, what it is, how some of the actors are operating. But we might move on now to the big question of what do we do with our partners, organisations within working on development, human rights, many areas. What should we actually do with this information and all these issues of concern? So, how should we respond to the attacks? How can we work together to counter both the narrative and the influence and the practice? So, Mina, very interested in your views on these questions.
Thank you. I hope from what you've heard, it's clear that we're in a change of an era. So it's not just that we're having a bad few years. This really is a change of an era. And so with that assessment, there are a few things. I just came from the AWOD conference that's in Bangkok, and to see that level of mobilization, more than 4,000 feminists from around the world, very, very clear on their direction of travel, how they're going to do this, the big themes coming out of that meeting, what the movement cares about is how to address this issue of violence, which is also perpetrated by the West, and I spoke earlier around the moral authority piece. We have to listen to people from the global majority. It can no longer be the West setting the agenda, because we all see what's happening around us. There are highly activated social movements. The 4,000 in-person meeting I spoke to, a few thousand online. Organisations like IPPF, we are in 150 countries. We're locally led. We don't have foreign workers in countries. It's all national. That is very activated, and if we can bring back this attention to regaining our moral authority, to really speaking to what's happening, to not being silent and colluding, we do have a chance. But it requires a lot of courage, it requires a lot of self-reflection about why we haven't said as much as we should have, and the consequences of that in the US, for example. But there is a very, very big, already activated movement underneath us. And the second piece I would say around what to do, and this is particularly relevant for this conference, is I would urge everyone to have a look at MSF developed these case studies around really, really learning from particular situations. What is the lesson for our organisations? And there's one, for example, they did on Rwanda. So what happened in Rwanda to allow that genocide to continue? And a lot of the lessons is international organisations and humanitarian workers treated it as a technical problem. And that's a very comforting space to be in, because you don't have to speak to the ugliness of the politics. But it meant that the response that should have happened earlier failed to happen. And so for anyone that is working in that more technical humanitarian piece, I would challenge you to just really question that position and really learn from what we've learned many decades ago. There's incredible evidence by MSF and other organisations. And it's just a good question for us about what we can do now, what we can do over the next 10 years. I'll say a little bit more on that later. That's the immediate pieces we can do right now. In Australia, you're lucky, everyone has to vote. Amazing. We don't have that privilege that can be exercised globally. But I would say connect to your peers and your comrades in global majority countries and make sure you're having these conversations.
Thanks, Mina. That's some really great, very practically focused advice too. Jack, would you like to elaborate or expand on some of these same issues about what do we do?
I would love to. So there's a kind of emerging quote, I guess. If I could find the person who said it, I would absolutely attribute it. But I think it might be one of those like stitch in 9 saves time, whatever. Journalism used to end when you pressed publish, and now it begins when you press publish. I think that provides a really good kind of guide for the way in which we need to move through a misinformation space. To use the example of perhaps Jelle's report, you would not, in this current environment, publish a paper that is extensively researched and backed up with authoritative information and just allow it to kind of be torn apart by an environment that is seeking to undermine the facts presented in the report. You walk with the report, you defend it publicly, you bring in other areas of expertise, you walk with the information. I think that's a really targeted way to approach misinformation, which is that flooding of an ecosystem. If you are an NGO or civil society actor, or even an individual with an online presence, I think it's really important to have company best practice policies around how to deal with misinformation. Misinformation is a little bit easier because you are just, particularly if you have a spectacularly well-researched report like Jelle's, because you're standing with the truth there. Disinformation is a little bit more difficult, but also relevant to this conversation because it's political and it's targeted and it's very well funded. And that requires, I think, perhaps things that Mina was tapping into, ideas of global solidarity and connecting with international communities that are also advocating for the same causes that you're advocating for. I think that is, pretty much it in regards to tactics, but it's complex and nuanced, so.
Fair point, Jack, fair point. Thank you. We've referenced a little bit the connecting with local communities. A lot of us here, I think today, not all, but many represent sort of more global or regional organisations in various forms, but we know it's often local activists, often at very grassroots level, who experience the worst of the anti-rights attacks and really live out the impacts. So I'd be interested also for any other broader advice. I think we've sort of touched on this already about, for those of us who do work in these more sort of global or regional spheres, what can we do to even better support colleagues and partners really on the ground? So I think Mina and Lady, it'd be great to hear your takes on these.
Yes.
Thank you.
Back to this point on the change of an era and specifically this region and the geopolitical dimensions that Jelle has spoken to. I want to raise as well what we're seeing outside of this region and how it coalesces here. So I've been working in sexual reproductive health and rights for more than 20 years now, long enough. And what is very unique, we talked about all the elections this year, but the other piece is around the militarisation of the service space in a way that we have never ever seen, I've never seen. And this year alone, I can tell you in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Sudan, we've had all of our service sites destroyed, bombed. We have had all of our health workers displaced, their homes destroyed, all of the commodities that they need to provide sexual reproductive health and rights services gone in those bombings. And I share that with you here because it is of such gravity to be able to, the impact of that for women that need a service, the impact of that for people whose lives depend on receiving one of those services is so profound. The targeting of health workers in a way that we've never ever seen please listen to that, because the space here in this region, if this trend of violence continues, we will anticipate that violence in this region. And it impacts all of the work we've done for generations, really, on advancing sexual reproductive health and rights. And we can't afford to lose that progress now. But back to the point of how we support our peers and colleagues, they are our peers and colleagues. Those health workers we've worked with our whole careers, those people that access services, they've been coming to us in Palestine. It's been for 50 years, Lebanon similar. We need to support our peers and colleagues now and our communities. I'll hand over to you, lady.
Thank you, Mina. So what I'd like to add is to continue building that solidarity, to stand in solidarity with each other. I know that we have these different issues, like even these megatrends, like split us apart, climate change, digitalization, demographic shifts. We're aging. We should not focus on young people. We should have more families. So that's what's keeping us apart. And we need to see the thin line that cuts across, like intersectionality of these issues, and especially work with young people, because then we reshape how they think, and they think of better solutions to our issues that they were growing up into. And that's what IPPF brings into the conversation, is like to put in young people as partners in addressing solutions. So listening to their voices, we have them in our governance, in our programs, and we want them to reshape these discussions. And we want them not just for supporting sexual and reproductive health and rights, but also seeing that across human rights, like even working in the areas of climate change, migration, and peace and security, especially for our region.
Thank you, lady. That's very good advice. Thank you. I have to confess I've been so absorbed in the discussion that I'm not doing particularly good time management here. So what I'm going to do is roll the last part of what we've planned for our panel insights together a little bit to fast track it so we can still allow enough time for questions. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panellists, we are interested in some broad advice about what Australia's role should be on supporting pushback. It's a big question, but it'd be great to touch on that. But also then, I think just, any key messages or key takeaways, things that you haven't had the chance to share that you want to message. So if I could ask each of you to briefly cover those points. I might start with you, Jack, if I can turn to you. Thank you.
Very easy question. Thank you so much. It is. Australia has a significant role in the region and globally, I would say. I want to reiterate Mina's really, really poignant points and say that, we don't think about these things in the abstract. We have official obligations under UN Resolution 1325, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, to think about the ways in which the Australian presence moves through the world, our foreign policy aims, our military presence abroad, and the ways it impacts vulnerable communities like women. Climate change is an exacerbator of this. People in a climate disaster, literature or data shows us that women are 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster than men, for a myriad of reasons. And Australia also has a really securitized, role in climate response, because unlike many other countries in the world, we really use our military for climate responses. We're very, very liberal with that. So that means mainstreaming those obligations, particularly in those situations in which women and young people and minoritized communities are particularly vulnerable because of those exegesis forces. That feels really, really important. Australia itself can be a leader in the space for the anti-rights rollback in the region. I think there is a moral obligation for that. It feels a little silly to propose to the room that there are various existential crises around democracy happening, because I'm sure we are all intimately aware of them. But I think Australia is well placed to respond to particularly some of these regional factors. I think Professor Jo Wallace from the University of Adelaide had a really great comment where she remarked that the one thing that civil society or academics or industry professionals can provide for an organisation, a ministry like DFAT, is that we have time. They have to be incredibly responsive to on-the-ground issues. We have the time to be able to sink our teeth into specific policy aims, to back it up with research, and to provide them with expertise. I think the frameworks that have emerged from this most recent ministry that are currently waiting to be published, and I really hope they will be published in the next year, but we have an LGBTIQ+ framework, a human rights framework, a gender-informed equality framework. That's the perfect marriage between that level of expertise that we can provide, everyone in the room as experts in these spaces, and for our foreign policy aims as well. It is an existential crisis, and we need to be very, very present and concerned, but proactive as well, because particularly in this next upcoming election, I think that there are certain ideological camps that benefit from the idea of a silent majority. They can allude to the fact that, well, I speak on behalf of a very large community of people, and then when asked to point to where those communities are, no one's putting their hands up. So you can directly, I guess, undermine that argument by being a vocal majority and, kind of speaking with your chest, as the kids say. It's a great note to end on.
I'll be really quick. So DFAT already has incredible presence in its humanitarian response in this region. It is the leader. I don't live in this country anymore. I can attest globally it's so critical, and that needs to continue. Seeing Australia more pronounced on human rights will only be a good thing. We need that moral authority from the West somewhere, please. And to all the points that I was making earlier, always stand with the girl over the gun.
Thank you. No, thank you. That's great practical advice. Jelle, can I turn to you now? Thank you.
Of course. I'm going to be as quick, but I have more points, so I'll talk a bit faster. I heard climate several times, very important issue. I broke my mind and thought long, how can you blame climate change on the LGBTQ community? But I found a way. They're so creative. They can blame all the problems we face to whatever marginalized community and just bash them. And of course now even the LGBTQ community is going to be excluded from disaster recovery and evacuations. That's just insane. Anyway, it's heartbreaking. I'm not DFAT, and I'm not UN anymore, so I can be a little bit more direct than I used to be. Please lose your naivety. We are so naive, and we are being played like a fool. And the silent majority, or the bench sitters, or the movable middle, what have you not, they're being, as the metaphor goes, slowly being boiled to death as the frog. And we need to reach them. If some of you is going to ask, so how are you going to reach them? I don't know. Because that's so difficult. Because we use our own channels, but then it stays in our own bubble, in our own echo chamber. We need to get out there. I have several phones just to monitor the other bubbles, because I need to stay fresh. And I also need to see what White Lives Matter is posting. It makes you sick, but you need to know. So lose your naivety. Also in this region, I've seen projects financed, including by Australia, on gender-based violence. Then you talk with the people conducting and implementing those in the local communities. And then they first start talking about how women should be protected. That's great. That's why they receive the funding, etc. So we champion them, make them champions. And in the same sentence, they say, and they should stop wearing dresses. Pants, they should wearing their dress. They should stay at home to nurture the leaders of tomorrow. So you see, that's also a part of the naivety that we see, that we fund projects and we are so happy that we found a local champion and we stop asking questions. So keep asking those questions. It's the same as church leaders that we see that, for example, in one of the countries we saw that even the government body responsible for taking disinformation offline, the government body responsible for taking disinformation offline has signed an agreement with one of the church leaders so that they can take out all the Mary Stopes information about contraception, because that kills. So if you see now that the government is being used, and that's governments that, of course, Australia has very good cooperation with, or challenging cooperation, what have you not. But there is cooperation because there's an exchange of information, how to take down disinformation. If you then say MSI is spreading disinformation because they talk about contraception and that's lethal, then you have a problem. So how to fight it? Get off the high horse. I'm not saying do immoral stuff, but we are so self-righteous and we are so proud of our own morale. We are right and they are wrong. It's more complex and nuanced, as Jack said. You forgot it the last time, so I thought I'd repeat it for you. Then, if you look at the groups, they are very much united. They're united on hate and opportunism. But keep in mind, even though they're united on that topic, they are very different on others. Use that. Use the same tactics. Highlight those differences. They will fall apart. Just like many LGBTQ organizations fall apart because there is inside battle. Not only because we want to profile ourselves for donors, because that's what's happening. We have information and we will use it to profile for the donors because that's your lifeline, right? But then maybe you hurt your neighbor. So be more strategic with what you do. Be better informed. And since we are combining this last element, I really call upon Australia as one of the last standing solid democracies. I hope really that this coming election will not change that. Start treating this not as an LGBTQ problem, not in a silo of SRHR. Start to see this as a national security problem. This is geopolitics at its finest. This is not only about Taiwan. This is Taiwan times 10 in the region. This is about military preparations. This is about subverting the stability of the democracies in the region. So I really hope that you can bring this message to the governments that you need a cross-government approach on this and take it away out of the silos of gender, healthcare, etc. It's cross silos. And I'll leave it here.
Thank you. Thanks, Jelle. And I'll just pass to Lady now for any...
I think they've said everything. But I just wanted to circle back on how Bronte started and then my reflections on that. Then acknowledging the First Nations and the peoples on the land. I think that's very important to amplify these voices on the ground as of global north. So it's not like west. Australia is not west of the Philippines, but it's like global north. To actually protect these spaces, to protect these human rights instruments, because you have that power. Yeah. But also that influence. Wherever in the region, Australia has supported a lot of pieces of development. And as with has highlighted, like SGBV, SRHR, humanitarian response, keeping effects of climate change manageable. So there's a lot that we look to Australia in terms of like forging the evidence, but also like pushing the advocacy forward, gender transformation and social inclusion, like big words, but like they mean a lot to communities. And we need you to protect the workers, the frontliners, to keep them safe, secure, but also like hold that space for everyone to equally participate and stand in solidarity. I guess that would, yeah. Thank you.
No, thank you. Great words of wisdom. Thank you. Thank you all. Fantastic insights and advice, really practical, constructive advice, which I will absolutely take on board for DFAT. We'll move on to questions, but I just highlight a couple of things just to give you a bit of a sense of, so much of this is so relevant to much broader work that we do in our foreign and trade policy, to be honest. But one thing just to emphasise and to assure you that I like to think DFAT has always had this approach, but I think we're getting better at it and it's even more centralised, is the locally led, locally driven solutions to issues. It's so obvious, but it is something that we need to continue to work on, and you'll see in our various strategies that are in place or being developed, that is really central, the central role of civil society, but then very much locally led, locally driven will continue to be very important for us. I think one thing that's come out about, I guess, about being really, not being naive, absolutely, and being clear about where different tactics and different approaches and pushback is coming from, and having as sophisticated as possible understanding of the motivations of different players, rather than having a sort of a simplistic or approach, is so important. It's something that in our broader human rights work we're absolutely giving a lot more thought to, is what are the motivations, where are they, and therefore how can you bring people along? I mean, that's what that's all about really, rather than having sort of set piece ideas about where things are coming from and what can we say in response to do. It's right, well, why? Getting a better understanding of why do people have this approach? Why are people being so easily co-opted in the first place? It's all those sort of questions that we are really trying hard to think more about, and it's invaluable, the sort of input and research that's feeding into that. Also absolutely about broadly sort of human rights being, and whatever component within that, not being siloed, and talking in much more compelling terms about it's about security. It's about much more than even the right per se, or the principle, which often doesn't gain traction anyway. We know it's hard to talk, it's getting harder and harder to get traction when you talk about it only in those terms. We have to keep doing it, but we can't just do that. We need to have a much more practical portrayal of what this means, and in a coherent way across the different, as you say, silos. So completely take on board all those points, really practical and great advice, which I certainly deeply appreciate. But we do want to have some questions now. I'm sorry we've compressed the time a little bit, but would love to take some questions now. So we've got some microphones. We've got straight in front of me here, we've got a couple of people. Should we take a couple of questions just nearby each other? That might be easier, and then, so why don't we take a couple of questions first here, and then we'll have some answers and then take some more questions.
Hi, that was a great discussion. Really enjoyed it. I'm Arushi from DT Global. I'm a lawyer there. The thing about misinformation policy was a great one. Thanks. 2 questions. One, what are the things that that divide the far right? Because you mentioned that you need to figure those out. So I really want to figure those out. And then the second question is, do you have any comments on the role of social media players, Facebook, Instagram, on the how different Twitter looked for your dad, and that's the same with me. His Facebook looks very different to mine. Is there ways in which we could regulate that space, or even try to access the other side, as you said? Know what White Lives Matter is doing, but for my dad to know what Black Lives Matter is doing too. Just those 2.
Okay, let's just take another question.
Thank you. My name's Jason Brown. I'm the Partnership Director of the Australian Humanitarian Partnership and a parent of young adults. Just a quick observation from my humanitarian hat. Interesting that we talked about, and Jelle, you mentioned a few times that faith leaders can often are important messaging, both anti-messaging, but I think we've got an example in our program of using theology to counter some of that messaging, particularly in the disaster risk management space, climate change space, but I think it's also been used successfully in PNG around the gender space. So just an observation there that I think there are two sides to that. With my parent hat on, I wanted to talk about where we've got a rights. So we're talking about rights here. There's recent controversy about limiting age access limits to social media. And in one time, as Jack talked about fogging and flooding, I thought to myself, that's really interesting. It's a way to potentially protect young people from these types of tactics, but at the same time, are we not, and thinking of ladies' comments, is there not a rights issue here with young people having access to information? So I just wanted to throw that across as a topic for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we might see if there's any comments and then we'll take a couple more questions, but any of the panel like to jump in?
Yeah, I can kind of, I guess, combine an answer for both of you, if that's okay. The regulation of social media is tricky. Again, Australia demonstrates an appetite that they want the social media companies to regulate the content themselves. I think what you don't do is boot under 16-year-olds off the internet, or off social media, because that does not, I mean, the emerging literature proves to us that only leads to further likelihood of radicalisation for particularly young people. They find, like, if they're not on the regulated social media sites, then they're turning to the dark web, they're turning to unregulated forums like 8chan and 4chan, and it's a much less, a space with much less oversight to it. The thing that perhaps needs to happen at a generational level or a social level is that media literacy being taught in schools. That's a really important intervention that I think the government needs to think about. But it's tricky while it seems like there's a bit of a passing of the buck from the government to ask the social media companies to entirely regulate or to boot off demographics. And that's just, again, to use that analogy, it's not a response, it's not a solution, it's just a band-aid that you're slapping onto a problem. I think Jelle's going to have some great comments about what divides the far right. The only thing that I would say is that they're strange bedfellows. And a lot of far right ethno-nationalist rhetoric is deeply, deeply racist. So at the bare minimum, these transnational networks are made very uncomfortable by the fact that they are reckoning with, they are multicultural spaces and they are entirely opposed ideologically to being a multicultural space. So it is, I think, monopolising on that would be a good first step, perhaps.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that. So this year, the intergovernmental organizations on media just gathered and they were just discussing regulating social media. So it's happened in India. Malaysia is on the way to legislate social media, treating it as a utility, like your water and these things. So it was like, okay, so they're already in that direction. I think the clear question is that how do we regulate it and will it protect everyone's human right instead of like silencing these spaces, like co-opting and the whole that Jelle will talk to.
When we had a lot of, as said, I'm a former intelligence officer. When I started early 2000s, it doesn't show, but yeah, it's a long time ago. We had a lot of hate speech by imams in mosques. What did we do? We banned them, so they couldn't come over from Saudi Arabia or from wherever they came. So what happened? Did it stop? No. It shattered like a broken window, like a broken mirror, into very small pieces. They moved into the living rooms, as we call living room sessions, serving tea, grouping with friends. And I can tell you, having devices and monitor events in one mosque with thousands is easier than thousands of living rooms. It didn't stop, it just went out of sight. So with regard to keeping the internet, or, and this is of course not for me to speak about, but in your national situation from youngsters, that's insane. I mean, you should explain that smoking is bad and drinking is bad. It's not going to stop them, right? They just need to understand and learn. Anyway, so exactly, and I have a dog called Trip. That's not that's no coincidence. It's just we joke about it. Even with my two kids, we joke about it. They need to. I mean, anyway. What divides them? That's a very interesting question. That can go from local, maybe even to a rivalry between soccer teams or whatever. They have a beautiful soccer stadium now donated by China, by the way, in, where is it, Solomon, I think. Incredible. Anyway, use those elements. They can be small, it doesn't really matter, but just blow them wide open. And there's the other thing that I really hope that the colleagues will bring into the Australian government. When talking about, we do a project together with the Council of Europe, and it's about measurement of the effectiveness of counter-narratives. Right? There's a narrative, and you want to counter it. So the effectiveness of counter-narratives, we monitor the activities of several CSOs in Europe active on counter-narratives, on hate speech on LGBTQ, hate speech on abortion, hate speech on what have you not. Does it work? No. It doesn't work. Why? Because it's launched to the heart and the response is with the head. Two different levels of communication. You need to target the heart, the emotion. And it's actually one of the conversations that we had with one of the faith leaders in the region. They laugh about it because they know how to reach the hearts. And the government only knows how to bring numbers. Oh, see how much we donated after these past decades. Does it change their hearts? Other big topic, mark this, in a few years you will be overloaded with it. Homeschooling, the next go-to. Really, really careful about that. Please pay attention. It is the way how to get those kids out of the schooling system and be able to, you know, well, I wouldn't say brainwash, but you know. And then, but the theology for good, that's so important because without the faith leaders, especially in this region, you're not going to do anything. We are in an alliance, and we're fortunate enough to have leaders of faith in that alliance, and we talk about exactly these things. Who are the people from the church that disseminate this terrible information, making women into targets? And there are faith leaders who know how to reach the hearts of the communities. So we definitely should not put them in the bad corner. Definitely not. And there are great faith leaders out there. So I'll leave it here, but yeah, is that okay?
Thank you. That's excellent. Thank you. No, and it resonates very strongly, a lot of those points in terms of the way we need to adapt and evolve too as a bureaucracy. Thank you. All right, we'll take a couple more questions or a few more questions. I think there were a couple of hands up over here as well, so we might just do in this block if there's one or two, and then I see a few more here. So let's take a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Jo Hall. I'm a consultant, what I used to be with the aid program with AusAid and DFAT. I was very interested to hear about the reference to the genocide in Rwanda, and all the time that everyone's been talking, and I have to feel like I belong to those naive people, and now I feel like that's been removed completely. Because everything you've been saying is what my 30-year-old child has been trying to tell me for the last few years. They will be very proud that when I report back to them that they were right, and my optimism was ill-placed. I'm worried about your safety, so I wondered if you might comment on that. But also, I feel like the genocide in Gaza is happening as we speak, and Australia is being remarkably quiet about that. And included in that is the murder of humanitarian workers, which Mina, thank you for referring to that as well. I feel like if we let this genocide continue and stay silent, then it invades everything else that we've been talking about. So we can't just look at this in one siloed way and pretend that our region is isolated from the rest of the world. It's not. So my question really is, what is Australia going to do about prosecuting war crimes, making use of the international system, and so on and so on? So those are my two questions. One, the earlier one was, how safe are you? And I genuinely worry about that.
Questions over here. A couple of people have their hand up over on this side. If there weren't any others here, why don't we just take a couple more here?
Thank you. I'm Didar from App Global. I think I just don't want to take the conversation somewhere else. It was really great questions from her. But just research we conducted, I found that most of the sources for the disinformation and misinformation is relied on some information that we assume that those are credible information. Those who are spreading and sharing this information, misinformation and disinformation, they are not technical people usually. And it's not just about talking or targeting the heart or the emotions. It's also to providing technical details to convince people and to encourage them to stand against something. So I just wanted to, so in this research actually, we found that usually the local authorities, the government, with low capacity, they cannot utilize the right and credible information and also not very proactively engaging the local organization before you are targeted by the anti-movement or whoever is sharing this information. So I just wanted to actually ask, in your experience, how to actually deal with these scenarios in the situation that the government authority themselves are the key causes of this misinformation and disinformation.
And just one more, I think there was another up the end of this line here. We might just take one more.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I'm Christine Ozawa from Samdana Institute from the region. Appreciate the rich sharing from the resource persons. Also appreciate the looking back at what has been done, what has happened, and how things have evolved. But I was wondering of two things. One was how much of the religious conservative actually contribute to the swing to the right? How much of what we have not done as human rights advocates, as social movements, have allowed some of our narratives to be hijacked by the pro-rights movement? So how much of it is actually our fault that we've provided them the space, we've actually provided them the opportunity because we have not done as much as we have promised to. So you will see that many of the populist politicians use many of the words that was used 10 years, 20 years ago by social movement activists. So, and if so, what reflection and what was we do, not just to, when there's a saying in my country, when you point to someone, there's actually 4 fingers pointing at you, only one pointing at the person that's actually you're pointing to. So how much of what we're doing now is still finger pointing, and less, reflecting on what we should do better and what we should do more of?
Thank you. We've almost run out of time, but we'll pick up some answers in a moment. I'll just mention very briefly one point, which I think goes to some of the different points we made about, because I think there's some issues around implied, Western hypocrisy or Western constructs being imposed, and it affects all sorts of geopolitical and approaches towards conflict. And I think broadly there's some big issues there. I think it's, obviously in our human rights work in particular, it's something that we have to approach in a very honest way. I think on the issue of Western moralising or Western moral high ground or Western lecturing, all these issues, I think we have to be honest about over time, you know, that there is a legacy there that is not without some foundation. I think we just have to be very self-aware and I think that goes to the question of how we engage on issues. If we're going to be credible, we have to have that spirit of self-reflection and be quite explicit about that in all we do in order to have the credibility, because the history, and then of course if you go back to colonial times, of course there are real issues there, and we can't pretend otherwise. That said, we also have to be very aware that attributing or describing human rights as a Western construct that's being imposed is absolute nonsense, and we have to call that out as well, because that's what we find around many of these issues, is that, you know, women's rights are a Western construct. Sexual orientation, being open to differences in sexual orientation, are a Western concept. So on those issues, you know, this is a point about agendas frankly being hijacked and exploited. On those points, I think we also, I think we have to be mindful of both. The self-reflection is really, really critical and fundamental to everything we do, or we get nowhere. But equally, we have to be very mindful that these issues are being exploited and completely misrepresented. And issues around the history of diversity and inclusion in the Pacific and the languages that apply around that way pre-exist colonial times. It's though we have to showcase and talk about these issues otherwise, because a lot of those issues do, when you combine that with the religious far right, of course, it's very easy to just say equality and tolerance and inclusion are Western constructs. So I think we have to be, we just have to be mindful of when and how that's being used, and make sure we do try for consistent standards ourselves, but also really call it out when it's being misused. Just a few observations, but sorry, we'll turn to other colleagues.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you.
And important points. I'm going to respond quickly to the question of safety, and say that I am a woman that grew up in Australia. You never feel safe here because of men's use of violence. And I hope that is something that everyone in this room carries forward. And from outside Australia, we were so heartened to see the protests happening recently, and yes, I have so much hope that this country can resolve this issue of violence against women. And I've also worked in abortion work for absolutely ever, so you also never feel safe doing that. It's probably not the right answer. I recently was in Syria and Lebanon visiting some of our services, and we had these intensive security briefings. And I have to say the briefings, which were about what we're trained to fear, were very, very different to my experience, where we would be at dinner, there would be Israeli drones over our dinner table, we would be driving down the road and cars and the people in them would just be vanished. And that's just me as someone going in briefly, but that is the conditions that people are living in every minute. And my safety concerns are small, honestly, compared to that. I'll let my other colleagues answer differently. And in terms of the speaking out, I'm really glad your kids are having the conversation with you. That is amazing. And in terms of Australia's role and everybody's role, I mean, international humanitarian law is very, very clear. It's not complicated. The really critical thing at the moment, and I hope to see leadership from Australia for this, but what's happened to the Security Council over the last year, it puts all of us at such extreme risk. And so not just personal safety, but global safety and accountability. I really hope that Australia will play a critical role in repairing that. I think we're all equally depressed around what we've seen. I might stop there because I feel like we're time sensitive and I really want to hear from other people, especially around safety. But in other areas.
Safety is an issue. Last year we exposed an oligarch responsible for the deportation of the children in the Ukraine, published in the New York Times. You can imagine that after that, the digital cyber attacks, they went through the roof. That's cyber. We consider that to be a compliment. We're doing something right. But yes, there are big risks. I mean, these are not just low criminals that we are targeting, that we are exposing. This is the worst of the worst. And sometimes when I speak with audiences, I see people with tears in their eyes because finally they are recognized and that they are not crazy, that this is a thing, and they feel not alone anymore. And that's worth everything.
Thank you.
I guess to speak to that, because living as a person in a developed country, a woman like that, you have so many layers of making you not safe. But I feel that if you speak up, then the risks are less because we would face the same issues if we stood silent. So I guess that goes along that please do not be silent and stand again in solidarity. Thank you.
On the note of safety, I mean, I'm a white bloke in Australia, albeit with a bit of sugar in the tank. So I recognise that there are intersecting levels of privilege that really inure me to those ideas of personal danger to my safety. But my research, I'm privileged to interact with people who, due to circumstance, are incredibly vulnerable from the societies that they live in. My primary concern, I think, is the keeping open communication with those people, keeping track of their safety, helping where I can, and where is ethical. But I guess my plea to the room would be just, there are kind of forces at work that would encourage you to think of that silent majority or that kind of normative experience, and in doing so abandon the most vulnerable people in our society and the most vulnerable people in a global society. The one thing, or one of many things that you need to bring to this work, the work that you're all doing in the room, is those vulnerable people that they're asking you to leave behind need your presence and solidarity the most. So stand with them.
Thank you very much. That was a really nice note to end on, Jack. Can I just thank everyone for coming? Can I thank our panellists for their extraordinary insights and generosity and honesty and bravery? And can I just, without overstating it, can I just thank you all for... No, I'll get emotional, sorry. I'm so sorry, but it's just so important what everyone is doing. And I want to recognise the decisions that everyone makes to work on the things that you're working on is so inherently brave. And I just really admire that. I'm so sorry. It's just, you're all just... Thank you so much. I'm just moved and inspired by you all. So thank you. Thank you so much.